Pastoralists in the Modern World. Introduction to the chapter. In many parts of India, we can see nomadic pastoralists on the move with the herds of goats and sheep or camels and cattle. So what are nomads? Nomads are people who move from one place to the other to escape harsh weather and to find conditions suitable to earn a livelihood. There are different communities of nomadic pastoralists in India. Pastoralists are people who earn their living by raising and herding livestock. Here we can see the nomadic pastoralist with the herd of cattle and sheep. Now let us see the pastoral nomads and their movements. The nomads living in these different terrains follow various seasonal movements to earn their livelihood. The Gujjar Bakarwals of Jammu and Kashmir raise herds of goats and sheep and earn a living through livestock. They follow an annual cyclic movement between the winter and summer for grazing grounds to find pasture for their herds. In the winter, when the mountains are covered with snow, they live in the low hills of the Shivalik range, while in the summer, several of their households journey together in a procession as a single group called as Khalifa. Here we can see the pastoral nomads of Jammu and Kashmir. When the snow melts and the high passes were clear, many of them moved on to higher mountain meadows. This pattern of cyclic movement between summer and winter pastures was typical of many pastoral communities of the Himalayas, including the Bhotiyas, Sherpas and the Kinnauris. Now let's see the nomadic pastoralists of the plateaus, plains and deserts. The Dhangars are a pastoral community of the central plateau of Maharashtra. They consist of shepherds, blanket weavers and buffalo herders. During the monsoon, they stay in the central plateau of Maharashtra, which is a semi-arid region with low rainfall and poor soil. This is an ideal place for their livestock as sheep cannot tolerate the wet monsoon conditions. Dry crops like bajra are grown and the area also provides a grazing ground for their flocks. After the harvest in October, they move west in search of pastures to reach Konkan. The Gollas herd cattle, where the Kurumas and Kurubas raise sheep and goat and sell woven blankets. In the dry season, they all move to coastal tracts and leave when the monsoon arrives. There are other group of grazers such as the Banjaras who are found in Uttar Pradesh, Punjab, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh and Maharashtra. They move in search of pasture land for their cattle, selling plough cattle and other goods to villagers in exchange for grain and fodder. The Raikas are a nomadic tribe of Rajasthan. They combine cultivation with pastoralism to overcome the difficulties posed by the meager and uncertain rainfall in the region. During the monsoon, the Raikas of Barmer, Jaisalmer, Jodhpur and Bikaner stay in their villages. By October, when the grazing grounds are dry, they move in search of other pastures and water and return during the next monsoon. There are two groups, Marus, also known as the desert Raikas, who herd camels, and other group who rear sheep and goat. Nomadic pastoralists adjust their movements and activities according to the surrounding conditions to make a living. Unlike the mountain pastoralists, it was not the cold and the snow that defined the seasonal rhythms of their movement. Rather, it was the alternation of the monsoon and the dry season. These conditions govern the cyclic movements of pastoralists in the plateaus, plains and deserts. Colonial rule and pastoral life. The life of pastoralists changed dramatically under the colonial rule. The colonial rulers wanted to transform all grazing lands into cultivated farms. This was necessary to increase land revenue. Additionally, increasing the cultivated land was necessary for increasing the production of jute, cotton and wheat which were required in England. Let us see some of the rules imposed by the British. Let's begin with the wasteland rules. Wasteland rules were enacted in different parts of the country from the mid-19th century. Under these rules, uncultivated lands were taken over and given to selected individuals. These individuals were encouraged to settle on these lands and were granted various concessions. Some of them were made headmen of villages in the newly cleared areas. The expansion of cultivated land resulted in significant reduction in grazing grounds. This created huge problem for the pastoralists. Next comes the Forest Acts. New Forest Acts were enacted by the mid-19th century. Under these acts, many forests were declared reserved. Pastoralists were not allowed in the reserve forest. Some other forests were classified as protected. The pastoralists got some grazing rights in the protected forest, but their movements were highly restricted. These Forest Acts changed the lives of pastoralists. They could not enter many areas and entry to some other areas was restricted. So instead of following the seasonal cycle, they were forced to follow the new Forest Acts which disturbed their traditional ways of life. Next comes the Criminal Tribes Act. The nomadic people were viewed with suspicion by the colonial rulers. The Criminal Tribes Act was passed in the year 1871. Many communities of craftsmen, traders and pastoralists were classified as criminal tribes under these acts. They were forced to live in notified villages and the police officials kept a watch on them. The colonial government looked for every possible source of taxation in order to increase its revenue income. Tax was imposed on land, on canal water, on salt, on trade goods and even on animals. Next comes the grazing tax. Grazing tax was introduced in the mid-19th century. In most of the pastoral tracts of India, tax was calculated on the basis of per head of cattle. The tax rate went up rapidly and the tax collection system was made more efficient. The right to collect the tax was auctioned to contractors between 1850s and 1880s. These contractors tried to extract as high a tax as possible to recover their investment. By 1880s, the government began to directly collect taxes from the pastoralists. Now let's see how did these changes affect the lives of pastoralists. Nomadic pastoralists grazed their animals in one area and moved to another area. These pastoral movements allowed time for the natural restoration of vegetation growth. When restrictions were imposed on pastoral movements, grazing lands came to be continuously used and the quality of pastures declined. This in turn created a further shortage of forage for animals and the deterioration of animal stock. Underfed cattle died in large numbers during scarcity and famines. So how did the pastoralists cope with these situations? Let us see. Over the years, some richer pastoralists began buying land and settling down, giving up their nomadic life. Some became settled peasants cultivating land, others took to more extensive trading. Many poor pastoralists, on the other hand, borrowed money from moneylenders to survive. At times, they lost the cattle and sheep and became laborers, working on fields or in small towns. When pasture lands in one place was close to them, they changed the direction of their movement, reduced the size of the herd, combined pastoral activity with other forms of income, and adapted to the changes in the modern world. Here we can see the pastoralist. Now let's see the effect of colonial rule on the pastoralists of Africa. Africa, the second largest continent in the world with a history of colonialism, is home to many pastoral communities like Bedouins, Berbers, Maasai, Somali, Boran and Turkana. They live in semi-arid grasslands where agriculture is not possible and earn a living through their livestock like cattle, camels, goats, sheep and donkeys by selling their milk, meat, animal skin and wool. Some also earn through trade and transport, others combine pastoral activity with agriculture, still others do a variety of odd jobs to supplement their meager and uncertain earnings from pastoralism. Here we can see an African pastoralist. Like pastoralists in India, the lives of African pastoralists have changed dramatically over the colonial and post-colonial periods. So where has the grazing lands gone? The harsh effects of colonialism changed the lives of African pastoralists drastically. The Maasai tribe was victims of the colonial rule living on the eastern Africa. One of the major changes was the loss of pastoral lands. The European imperial powers scrambled for territorial positions in Africa, slicing up the region into different colonies in the late 19th century. Subsequently, the best grazing lands were gradually taken over for white settlement and the Maasai were pushed into a small area in South Korea and North Tanzania. The Maasai lost about 60% of their pre-colonial lands. They were confined to an arid zone with uncertain rainfall and poor pastures. By the end of colonial rule, the situation had reversed. Large areas of grazing land were also turned into game reserves like the Masai Mara and Samburu National Park in Kenya and Serengeti Park in Tanzania. A national park can be seen here. The loss of finest grazing lands and water resources created pressure on the small area of land that the Maasai were confined within. The closed borders. With the redrawing of borders, the movement of all the pastoralist communities was severely restricted. They were required to get special permits in order to move. Getting a permit was often difficult. People were severely punished for violating the laws. They were also not allowed to enter the market in white areas. They were viewed as savage and dangerous by the Europeans, and hence every effort was taken to minimize the contact with them. The restrictions under colonial rule did not entirely stop their trading activities, but they were now subject to various restrictions. What happened when the pastures dried? When rains fail and pastures are dry, cattle are likely to starve unless they can be moved to areas where forage is available. That is why traditionally pastoralists are nomadic, that means they move from place to place. But from the colonial period, the Maasai were bound down to a fixed area. They were restricted and confined within a reserve and prohibited from moving in search of pastures. Since they could not ship their cattle to places where pastures were available, large numbers of Maasai cattle died of starvation and disease in these areas in these years of drought. As the area of grazing lands shrank, the adverse effect of the drought increased in intensity. Within just 2 years of severe drought, more than half of the cattle in Maasai reserve died. Now we'll see, not all were equally affected due to the colonial rule. In the pre-colonial times, Maasai society was divided into two social categories, elders and warriors. The elders formed the ruling group and met in periodic councils to decide on the affairs of the community and settle disputes. The warriors consisted of younger people mainly responsible for the protection of the tribe. They defended the community and organized cattle raids. Here we can see the Maasai society. To administer the affairs of the Maasai, the British introduced a series of measures that had important implications. Chiefs were appointed for different subgroups of Maasai. The chiefs were made responsible for the affairs of the tribe. Several restrictions were imposed on raiding and warfare. This led to erosion of authority for both elders and warriors. A chief appointed by the colonial government often accumulated wealth over time. They could now buy animals, goods and land. They also lent money to the needy. Many of them began living in towns and involved themselves in trade. Thus, the chiefs became more powerful and lucky. The poor pastoralists did not have resources to tide over the bad times. Many of them had to migrate to towns in search of livelihood. Most of them continued to do odd jobs. Some lucky ones could get regular work in road or building constructions. Thus we can say a new distinction between the wealthy and the poor developed in the Maasai community because of the colonial rule. Let us quickly view the chapter Pastoralists in the Modern World. Pastoral nomads and their movements in the mountains. In winter, when the high mountains were covered with snow, the pastoralists moved to the shivalik range along with their herds. This is the Raikas group of Rajasthan. Colonial rule and pastoral life. Many acts were enacted by the colonial government on the pastoralists. They transformed their grazing lands into cultivated farms. Forest Acts was enacted. Tax was imposed on land, animal, etc. Pastoralism in Africa. The borders were closed for the pastoralists of Africa. When pastures were dry, nomads moved from place to place, but they were restricted according to the colonial government.